Hello, my name is Hasan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 62. Welcoming back my regular co-host today, Tom Libby.
Hey, everyone. Well, thank you for welcoming me back, Hasan. Very excited to be here.
And Tom is coming along at an auspicious time in the podcast. We were just talking a little bit off the air. I am in the process of fighting corporate giants in my own life. I'm having that weird moment, corporate and bureaucratic giants in my own life. And so it's interesting that in the month of June, a month of pride, as I mentioned before in the previous episode, that we're going to be talking about City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo. Now, this is a massive book, has multiple smaller books inside of it. It is right around 1,100 pages. Yes, I said 1,100 pages long. We will not be covering the whole book. Instead, what we will be doing is we will be reading from books 2, books 3, and books 4 excerpts today in order to buttress the arguments and the ideas that we laid out in episode number 61, where we discussed C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Because I think that during the era we are in right now, there's nothing that we need to be doing as leaders that is more impactful for the people who will follow us than figuring out how to debate, how to persuade, and how to convince. And St. Augustine of Hippo, in his lengthy book, The City of God, lays out a pattern of argumentation that is undeniable in its power. Matter of fact, without this book and without the efforts of St. Augustine of Hippo, and we'll talk a little bit about St. Augustine today on the podcast, without the efforts of St. Augustine, the initial first 1,000 years of Christianity probably wouldn't have worked out. Christianity probably would have been strangled in its cradle, and thus Darwinism, Nietzscheanism, and the postmodernism that we all live under right now, probably wouldn't have gotten legs underneath it. We owe a lot to St. Augustine, and we don't read him nearly closely enough. So as usual, we will start off with the book. From City of God. We are reading in book 2, chapter 21. And I quote, "If our opponents scorn the historian's judgment that the Roman state has sunk, quote, to the depths of depravity, unquote, if they are not troubled about the disgusting infection of crime and immorality which rages in it, so long as that state continues to stand, then let them listen not to Sallust's description of its degradation, but to Cicero's argument that it has now utterly perished, that the Republic is completely extinct." Cicero represents Scipio, the annihilator of Carthage, as discussing the state of the country when it was felt that it was doomed to perish through the corruption described in Sallust. This discussion is placed at the time when one of the Gracchi had been killed, an occasion from which Sallust dates the beginnings of the serious civil disturbances. Sallust records his death in this work. Now, Scipio said at the end of the second book, quote, "In the case of music for strings or wind and in vocal music, there is a certain harmony to be kept between the different parts. And if this is altered or disorganized, the cultivated ear finds it intolerable. And the united efforts of dissimilar voices are blended into harmony by the exercise of restraint. In the same way, a community of different classes, high, low, and middle, unites like the varying sounds of music to form a harmony of very different parts through the exercise of rational restraint. And what is called harmony in music answers in concord in a community, and it is the best and closest bond of security in a country. And this cannot possibly exist without justice." Close quote. Then, after a more extended treatment of the point describing the great advantage of justice to a community and the great loss occasioned by its absence, another of those present at the discussion, named Phyllis, puts in a plea for a more detailed treatment of the subject of justice, because it was at that time popularly supposed that some injustice was inevitable in the government of any country. Scipio agrees that this question needed investigation and explanation. He admits in reply that, in his opinion, what they have already said about the Commonwealth gives them no basis for proceeding further, unless they establish the falsity of the statement that injustice is inevitable in government, and further, the truth of the assertion that complete justice is the supreme essential for government. The discussion of the question is then deferred to the next day, and in the third book, the topic is thrashed out with the fiercest arguments. Philus undertakes to defend the position that government entails injustice, covering himself by disclaiming this as his own opinion. And he contends energetically for injustice against justice, asserting its superior utility for the country and striving to prove his point by plausible arguments and illustrations. Then Laelius, by general request, undertakes a defense of justice and asserts with all possible emphasis that nothing is so inimical to a community as injustice, and that a country cannot be governed and cannot continue in being without a high degree of justice. When this question has, in the general opinion, been dealt with sufficiently, Scipio returns to the interrupted discussion. He starts by repeating and supporting his brief definition of a commonwealth, that it is the weal of the community, and he defines the community as meaning not any and every association of the population, but an association united by common sense of right and a community of interest. He goes on to point out the advantage of definition in argument, and from these definitions of his, he derives the proposition that a commonwealth, i.e. weal of the community, only exists when there is a sound and just government, where the power rests with a monarch or with a few aristocrats or with the people as a whole. But when the king is unjust, a tyrant as he calls him in the Greek manner, where the nobles are unjust, he calls such a combination a factio, a caucus, or the people are unjust, and for this he finds no accepted term, unless he should call it a collective tyranny, then he holds the Commonwealth is not corrupt, as had been argued on the previous day, but by logical deduction from the definition, it ceases to exist at all. For there could be no weal of the community if it is unjust, since it is not associated by common sense of right and a community of interest, which is the definition of community. Thus, when the Roman Commonwealth reached the condition described by Sallust, it was not by now in the depth of depravity, in Sallust's phrase. It had simply ceased to exist, according to the reasoning produced by the discussion of the Commonwealth, which engaged the leading statesmen of the time. Similarly, Cicero himself, at the beginning of the fifth book, speaks in his own person and not in the person of Scipio or anyone else, when he quotes the line of Ennius, "Ancient morality and the men of old fixed firm the Roman state." And he continues, quote, "This verse, both its brevity and its truth, seems to me like the utterance of some oracle. For the great leaders could not have founded or could not have so long maintained such a great state with such a vast stretch of empire had there not been that morality in the community, nor could the morality have done so without the leadership of such men. Thus, before our own period, the traditional moral code produced outstanding men, and these excellent men preserved the code and the practices of their forebearers, whereas our age has received the Commonwealth like a magnificent picture which has almost faded away with age, and it is not only omitted to restore it with its original colors, it has not even taken the trouble to preserve what one may call the general shape and the bare outlines. For what remains of that ancient morality which, according to the poets, supported the Roman state, we see that it has passed out of use into oblivion, so that far from being cultivated, it does not even enter our minds. And what about the men? The morality has passed away through a lack of men, and we are bound to be called into account for this disaster, and even, one may say, to defend ourselves on a capital charge. For we retain the name of a commonwealth, but we have lost the reality long ago. And this was not through any misfortune, but through our own misdemeanors." Close quote. St. Augustine of Hippo, born 354 and died in 430, is among, as I stated before in the opening there, the most influential cultural figures of all time. His development of Christian theology during the formative 4th and 5th century shaped church teaching for at least 2 millennia. Ascending to influence as a teacher of rhetoric in Hippo, Rome, and Milan, Augustine initially embraced Manichaean religion and later came under the influence of Neoplatonism. In 83-87, however, his life dramatically changed direction with his conversion to Christianity. After conversion, he returned to his native North Africa, where he was ordained a priest and later made a bishop. As leader of the Church of Hippo, he preached widely and wrote voluminous biblical commentaries and apologetic works defending Christian faith against its rivals and detractors. along with more personal and pastoral works such as Confessions. We'll be reading selections from book 2, 3, and 4, as I said today, of his seminal Christian apologetic, The City of God, on the podcast. And this is follow-up, by the way, to a couple of episodes that we did last year on City of God. This is a big book, and we're going to be revisiting City of God quite a bit over the coming years. We covered book 1, and we also created an introduction to City of God. I would encourage you to go back to listen to those, and we will have links to those previous episodes from last year in the show notes where we covered City of God by St. Augustine. But we're going to delve into this today because I think, as was noted in the example where Augustine is quoting Cicero and Sallust, he's quoting the Roman pagan thinkers of his time in order to delineate Christian thinking from pagan thinking, in order to cleave and to clarify. I think there is something that can be gained from that, particularly in our time of mixed motives and of postmodern discourse. Leaders are operating in a time of chaos and confusion, and the leader who can speak the most clearly, who can cleave and clarify, is the leader who will win. And Augustine gives us a rubric, a framework to be able to do that. And he does it with a little bit of a rhetorical flourish. So, Tom, I know you haven't read City of God, which is fine. It is a massive book, like I said, and so I'm taking on all the weight of that. I'm reading it for you. But just from that clip there, where he quotes Cicero, who is talking about, the loss of the morals, right? The loss of the moral decline in Rome. And we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of moral decline, but let's sort of open up with this. How do we talk about how we talk about things? How do we structure arguments these days? This is one of the topic areas that we are going to talk about. I'm going to quote extensively from a guy who publishes for the Rational Mail Substack, but I want to get our initial thoughts on this laid down, because Augustine, one of the clever things he does in all of his writings, from Confessions to City of God, is he demands that the opponent in his argument on the other side of the debate, he demands rhetorically that individual live up to the logical conclusions of their debate or of their position, right? Whatever that is. We don't really do that these days, do we?
No, I don't think so. And I think there's also I've noticed over this, especially over the last 10 years, maybe even 5, whatever, but we've lost the art of agreeing to disagree and the ability to have a complete difference of opinion about a particular topic and still walk away friends, right? Like, we've gotten to the point now where it's, if you don't agree with everything that I agree with, and we're going to debate each other, it's debate and hate instead of agree to disagree, right? Like, if you don't agree with everything that I think, then I don't like you anymore. I can't be your friend anymore. We cannot be. I don't understand where or how that paradigm shift happened. I certainly wasn't when I was a kid or as I was growing up, and even in my young adulthood life, and it didn't even matter whether you were talking about the difference between, Roman Catholics and Protestants, or Democrats and Republicans, or males and female. It didn't matter. None of that. What mattered was, to your point a second ago, if you could debate somebody with some logic behind what your debate is, and you could live that logic, then it was okay to walk away friends. And you could just say, you can live your way, I'll live my way, or you can believe what you believe, I believe what I believe, but we still have a common ground of X, and we can still be friends because of X, Y, Z. I think there's definitely been some missing teachings of that, or some sort of like lack of I'm not even sure the words I'm looking for, but it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating to see. And from a personal perspective, I've literally had one of my children say that to me about a particular topic we were debating on. He was like, I can't even talk to you, Dad. And I'm like, you can't talk to me about this, or you can't talk to me, because that's two different things. Yeah. You can still come to me with your problems about life and about about finances and like you need help if you need to borrow money. I don't know, whatever your kids do with you, just for the listeners' perspective, I got 5 kids, and this only happens to be one of them that this happened with. But the reality of it is, it caused some friction that I wasn't comfortable with, and it wasn't that I was uncomfortable with the debate, and it wasn't that I wasn't uncomfortable with the topic. I was uncomfortable with the outcome, that he felt like he couldn't talk to me anymore because of this one conversation we had about this one topic. To me, that's asinine. But again, go ahead with your next.
Well, you and I both come from an era, and maybe this makes us dinosaurs, which is fine.
Archaic.
Yeah. Well, dinosaurs eventually turn into oil, and then we wind up in cars, so it's fine. Come down into the atmosphere, it's fine. I was raised with the idea that sticks and stones will break my bones, and you know what the end of this is, right?
Yes, of course.
But we are now in an era, and I can't believe it. I mean, like once a year, and maybe this is the time of the year I'll do this. Once a year on the podcast, I have to do a polemic. I have to do an apologia for free speech, right? And it's weird to me that in the year of our Lord 2023, I have to do an apologia for something that should be obvious. Words are not violence. They are merely things that are out there, not even things. They are expressions of objective or subjective ideas, thoughts, feelings, and emotions that, by the way, exist in people. They're the outward expression of an internal reality. And if I can't outwardly express my internal reality to you, how can we negotiate reality? How do we figure out what's real?
Goes to one of my favorite quotes of all time, which has been several times been associated to Einstein, but never proven that he actually said it. Mm-hmm. The actual, person who said it first or whatnot has never been proven, but it's perception is greater than reality. Right. Mm-hmm. So to your point, how do you debate reality when reality could be different based on who's viewing it or who's experiencing it? Or and the easiest, you can argue this all you want. People can argue that fact is fact. No, it's really not, because here's the thing. And this is the simplest version of this. You and I could be in a room for an hour with no way of telling the time. So no windows, just 4 walls and a door. You and I go into that room, an hour later, somebody opens the door and says, okay, guys, your hour is up. Come on out. And you look at it and go, oh my good Lord, that's already an hour. It went by so fast. The same exact hour I look at and go, that was the longest hour of my entire life. What rules the fact is our perception of it, not the actual fact. So to your point, the debate about reality should be continued to go on. And the idea of being able to view things from a different perspective, it just, I don't know where it went. I don't know where.
And what you're talking about is more than just a view of it, because a view of it is that that response after I get out of that locked room with no clock on it, right? That's the judgment I've made about that experience, right? My judgment was, it went by like that. Your judgment was, my God, this dragged. Okay. I think we've confused, and this is the cleaving and the clarifying.
Right.
We have to separate judgments of reality, which, by the way, are perceptions. Perceptions are just judgments of reality. I think we have to separate those from, and this is where now we get into neuroscience and philosophy, but from what is reality itself. And in that thought example that you have, reality is there was a box with 2 people in it with a clock. Or with no clock, with no clock. Is there any deeper meaning about those sets of objective facts? No, there's no deeper meaning about those sets of objective facts. And to seek deeper meaning from those sets of objective facts is part and parcel of the challenge of human history, which is one of the reasons why I on this podcast, I last year I did it a lot, not so much this year, but I believe that the meaning crisis in our culture, and particularly Western culture in general, but the United States in particular, I think is the most damaging and deleterious thing. It's even worse than climate change. We could fix climate change. We could fix global warming, global cooling, global whatever, methane from cows, smokestacks, whatever. We could fix all of that stuff if we could figure out the meaning crisis. And it's not necessarily an issue of, I don't think, why people take the certain meaning that they do from that set of objective facts of the room, the two people, and no clock. I don't think it's the why. That's interesting, but it's not particularly relevant. I think what's interesting is the what of the meaning. And to your point, we have those two. Can the two whats exist in the same space? Can they exist and everybody be okay? And when our whats come out as words, they're mere expressions. I don't know. I'm struggling with this massively because we're a literature podcast. We read literature, right? We read books. And what are books? Books are collections of words that are about ideas.
Yeah, precisely.
And now we live in it. Well, now we live in a time where like Roald Dahl is getting redacted, like the kids' book writer. You got people who are actively going back and rewriting Roald Dahl, or what's her name? Who wrote a bunch of the children's books for young women that were targeted towards young women. Judy Blume.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Judy Blume's getting rewritten too. So what are we? A sure sign of totalitarian tyranny is when you rewrite the past. That's what Stalin did. He hired people to retouch photos so that Trotsky would go away. Like we laugh about this, but like that's a true sign of a totalitarian being unable to deal with another set of realities.
Yeah.
And I don't know where we go from that. And I'm not being apocalyptic on the show. I want to be very clear. I just don't know where we go from that. I don't know what the end game is.
It's funny you say that apocalyptic, because I really do think that sometimes we're our own worst enemy with this stuff, right? Like we get so wrapped up in and I still think it's part of a bigger problem with the instant gratification generation and all this other stuff. That's all part of it, right? Yeah. So I tell people all the time, I say this lightheartedly, but I actually deep down believe it. I do think we're going to have a World War III. I don't think it's going to be Russia and the United States, or the United States and China, or China. I think it's going to be Amazon and Google. I think Amazon and Google are going to get really pissed off at the human race. And if they shut those two companies down, we do not exist anymore. The apocalypse is upon us if those two companies decide to go to war with each other. So it's like, but it's the same. Like, I know we're a little scattered a little bit, and I'm sure you'll bring it all together. You'll bring us back in a second, but I'm just saying that this is what starts heading us into this direction that we feel like there's no coming back from, right? Like that's the fact that now we have these companies that really control more of what we think and how we act and what we do than our parents, than our grandparents, that are teaching us the same way. Like you said earlier, the whole sticks and stones may break my bones scenario, but you can't get that from Google. You can't get that from Amazon. You can't get that from Spotify, or like now all of a sudden we're learning our life's lessons from these just things that don't matter. So now we feel like the rest don't matter.
Well, here's a bake your noodle question. Okay. This is interesting that you bring this up. One of the things that Augustine does in City of God is he presumes that the Roman pagans he's arguing against have free will. It's not even a thing. It's like air. Like he's not even, he's like, why would we even argue about that? Now, 2000 years later, we're not on the cusp. We've been saying for well over 80 years in our Western culture that there is no free will. We're just a set of automatons that are behaviorally programmed and driven by either nature or nurture, or it doesn't matter which one you pick. We're just behaviorally driven. And in the last 20 years of the internet, particularly the last 20 years of social media on the internet, the behaviorists who believe in the automation of humanity would say it's been proven that we are automatons because I can get you to click on some argument that doesn't matter so I can sell you more stuff.
Yeah.
And so there is, so we've destroyed
or drive your thought process.
Right. Or drive your thought process. So, they would push back against Augustine and say, or an Augustinian argument, and they would say, there is no free will. That's BS. That's the thing that we can get rid of. You're just a programmed robot, basically. Well, yeah. You're an AI with better software, which is why we fear our AI, by the way. That's why. I don't buy it, though. And I've never bought it. And the reason why I don't buy it is because I've known too many people in my life, personally and professionally, and maybe you could chalk this up to anecdote. Sure. Okay. But I know too many people in my life, and even myself, who at the moment of choosing made a choice. And Google is not there. Sorry. Amazon is not there. Sorry. Facebook is not there. They're not there at that moment of choosing. At the moment when I go, I'll grant you, things may be automated in my head. The click were, as Robert Cialdini, the author of Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion, would say, which I do believe in the psychology of persuasion. The psychology of persuasion works on me, absolutely, all the way up to the click were point where I have to decide, do I doom scroll past or click on that ad? But there's still a choice there. Even down to the microscopic fragment. I may not understand what the choice is. I may not even be a completely free actor in choice choice. But if I'm even 1% free in that, I'm still a free actor.
And I don't disagree with you. And when the scenario that we were talking about a second ago about whether you click it or not click it, the problem is that people like Google and Facebook and Amazon and whomever, they're playing the odds, because the odds are that, like, by the way, it doesn't have to be a click either. No, by the way, there was a point of time in the city that I live in, and I won't give it away if you've seen us on other podcasts, you probably already know where I live, but I won't give it away for this purpose because it might matter. So the city that I live in, there was clickbait all over the place about these protests and these marches and all these stuff that if you're this type of person, you should get involved in it. If you're that type of person, you should get involved in it. If you're this type of, a lot, just a tremendous amount on every facet that you can think of. Now, that being said, I'm walking down the street and I see this protest happening. It's not a click, but I might now go, oh, I'm going to go join them. Because I've seen this so many times. I've clicked on, I've read a bazillion times. It's been pounding into my brain that what they're doing is right. Or for the right reason or the right cause or whatever that is. So now I am less likely to walk away from that than I am now going toward it and joining in on this. And it's just a programming issue. Now, to your point, there is a point where it is my decision on whether or not I walk over to that protest and join them, or I just keep walking down the street. The problem is, I don't think the question is whether or not we have free will. I think the question is, do we actually use it? Do we actually deploy a fundamental thought process that makes us think, is this for me, or is this just because I've seen it 1,000 times? And I think that's what's lacking. It's lacking the ability. And again, like I said, it's because right now, a very high percentage of people in the younger generations are being educated by Amazon and Google and Facebook and all these things. Maybe not Facebook, because most of the young kids don't care about Facebook, but you know what I mean? Versus asking their parents, because that's what we did. We went to our parents for this information. What is this protest about? Why do you think it's this? Should I join it? No. Why? We continued to ask the why, but it was to people that we felt trusted on, that they were going to give us the right advice, not a click of a button that then we had to just decipher whether the algorithm was right or not. It's just. Yeah. And I don't mean to get amped up either, but it's frustrating. It is very frustrating.
No, get amped up, because this is worth getting frustrated about. This is the thing where, again, I think we have to cleave and we have to clarify. Those are the two things we have to do. And I think that there's another C in there, along with cleave and clarify. Without that, you get chaos. And then there's a fourth C in there, confusion, right?
Yeah.
And I do believe fundamentally that entities, maybe not necessarily Google and Amazon, but the entities that Google and Amazon pay taxes to, they like chaos.
Of course they do.
Works for them. And the more chaos there is, the more, as Augustine might say, immoral men. And he does talk about the chaos of the Roman Empire, by the way, quite a bit in the first few books of City of God. And the more immoral men can engage in immoral behavior for their own benefit.
Well, that's pretty funny. I was thinking as you were reading, oh my good Lord, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
That's right. And that is one of the things that you, yes. Yes.
You're reading about something that happened 2,000 years ago, or plus or minus a few, whatever, but
yeah,
a couple thousand years ago, and you're talking about judgment and how judgment makes, how it needs to be true and pure. And I'm like, good Lord, how do we not learn from this? Like we're still trying to figure out how to
and I think that's
judgments and
and I'm going to get into this today. This is another thing we're going to bring in. I think that that's a strength of the West. I don't think it's a weakness. Now, Oswald, I won't use Spengler. There were thinkers. Let me frame it this way. During and there have always been, but World War II was the most recent example. No, actually, World War II is the most recent example. Osama bin Laden. He was a very recent example. Osama bin Laden fundamentally believed that if he knocked out the World Trade Center, the United States would shrink and run away. He absolutely believed that. That's why he spent 10 years, 7 years, plotting, planning, putting things in motion, making it happen. Because he observed behavior in 1993 when the World Trade Center was attacked the first time that indicated to him from his Eastern worldview, and Islam is fundamentally an Eastern religion. So from his Eastern worldview, undergirded by Islam, he believed, and I'm not saying anything that isn't already written down that you can't find everywhere on, speaking of the internet, you can't find everywhere on the internet. Just go look it up. He believed that the United States would cut and run. They were, in his language, a weak horse. We were a weak horse. Now in 2023, 30 years on from 1993, we can look at the 17, almost 20 years we spent in the Middle East as a failure from our perspective in the West. But from the perspective of Al-Qaeda, what Osama bin Laden did was a massive strategic and tactical failure. Mm-hmm. Because just like the Japanese in World War II, or the Koreans and the Chinese in the Korean War, or I'm going to skip over Vietnam because it doesn't fit the model. Although, interestingly enough, all the way up to the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese generals even said we were basically beating the pants off of them. And then when the Tet Offensive occurred, because of the way that was framed in the American media, things were able to shift, and they sensed the shift and were able to move ahead of it rather than stick behind it. So I'm going to leave that one out because that one's a little bit more muddy. But through even the terrorist attack moments from the Marine, the release of the prisoners under the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra affairs, all that, all the way up to our ignominious great power withdrawal in Afghanistan recently. All of that, right? Our enemies look at that, and I do say our enemies because the United States does have enemies. But even broadly, philosophical enemies of the West look at that. They look at all of those kinds of events and they draw different conclusions than we do.
Yeah, true.
And we only know our conclusions. We don't know theirs. So for all of this new information we've got, the reason why we're still arguing like St. Augustine is because we're doing something that is fundamental to how the West actually operates, how Western thought actually thinks. And it starts from debate with a rhetorical flourish. It starts from debating about objective reality. It starts from even the Ottoman Empire noticed this when they invaded the Habsburg Empire, the Venetians, right? The Venetians were literally arguing all the way up to the point where like they had to get a cannon to shoot at the Turks. And the Turks were like at the gate. And the reason we laugh is because what the hell do we do here in America? We argue and 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 we argue, literally all the way up to the point of a soldier jumping out of a plane. But then once the soldier jumps out of the plane, well, I guess we're going now.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, there's some very Bernie Sanders things in here too. I'm going to point those things out today. Augustine was not a fan of endless war, but but my point is that idea of argumentation and debate and wrangling ideas, that's something that needs to be preserved in the West, and that's why free speech matters.
And free will.
And free will, and those arguments are ancient to the West. All right, back to the book. So that's our opening. So welcome to the podcast, folks. Back to the book. Back to City of God by St. Augustine. We're going to read book 2, chapter 6. I'm going to pick this up a little bit. By the way, the edition that we are reading, you did see it on the video of the podcast. And by the way, the full title of City of God is Concerning the City of God Against the Pagans. So my version was from Penguin Books, translated by Henry Benson, with an introduction by G.R. Evans. The City of God was first published in a book form, not a folio form, in a book form in 1467.
Wow.
Yeah. And this translation was first published by Pelican Books in 1972, with a reissued version in 2003 with better footnotes. So back to the book. Book 2, chapter 6, the City of God. This is the reason why those divinities have no concern. And by the way, those divinities he's talking about, he means the pagan gods like Jupiter or Zeus or Athena. Okay. This is the reason why those divinities have no concern for the morals of the cities and peoples by whom they were worshipped. Rather, they allowed the most terrible and abominable evils to have free play to the utmost detriment, not of lands and vines, not of houses and property, not even of the body, which is the servant of the mind, but of the mind itself, the actual ruler of the flesh. They allowed this. They did not use their awful power to prevent it, or if they did try to stop it, let us have the evidence. And we do not want to hear general assertions about whispers breathed in the ears of a chosen few and handed down by a secret religious tradition, teaching integrity and purity of life. Let the pagans show, or even mention, the place is consecrated for such gatherings where what happens is not the performance of spectacles marked by lewd utterances and gestures on the part of actors, with a free rein to every kind of depravity, not the celebration of the flight of kings, which is really the flight of all decency and morality, but where the assembled people can hear the commands of the gods about the needs to restrain avarice, to curb ambition, to put a check on lust, and where wretched men may learn the lesson that Perseus teaches in a voice of sharp reproach, quote, "Ye wretches learn what we men are, and for what life we're born. Find out your station in the race of life, and how to turn your corners. Learn the limit to be placed on wealth, and learn how much to pray for. The good that can be done with a crude coin, how much to give to country and to friends. Find out the role that God would have you play, the part assigned you in the scheme of things." Close quote. Let us be told in what places those divine precepts are regularly proclaimed in the hearing of the people assembled for worship. We, on our part, can point to churches set up for this very purpose, wherever the Christian religion is spread. There's a reason I like Augustine, I like reading that kind of rhetoric, because Augustine follows a very simple mode of argumentation. And it is a mode of argumentation that I think needs to come back into our discourse in the West, to Tom's point and my own point a little bit earlier here. And it could be summed up just sort of in this way. You, meaning the person on the other side of an argument, have a worldview. Here are the examples that I can provide on how that worldview is failing. Tell me why that worldview is better than what I have to offer from my worldview. And don't use my worldview to justify yours. Use your own. You believe in a certain set of things? Cool. Don't reference what I believe to justify yourself. This is an interesting discourse approach, right? It comes out of, it becomes the basis later on, many years later, for classical debate and debate among classical scholars. We live in a different kind of time, though, where that sort of classical discourse is seen to be intellectual, and maybe during its own time it was, but in our times, it is seen as being stifling or being a sign of supremacy of either race or intellect, and take your pick, because of the ability to even think through it all the way to its logical end. However, there is something valuable in this mode of rhetoric. Leaders can learn from this mode. Leaders can learn how to set up an argument, how to persuade, how to defend from this mode of argumentation. As a matter of fact, I would encourage leaders to think about this way. If you are faced with a person who is opposing you in a debate, ask them how and where their thought process will ultimately end up. See if they've done the logical conclusion thing. And by the way, if they haven't, if they get all upset, if they revert to emotional appeals, or if they blow up, or like Myra Burlow back in the day threatened to stab Jeff Bezos once in a meeting way back in like 2003. If they resort to intimidation and to violence, and by the way, not words as violence, actual violence. And I hate to tell you, leaders, you've probably won the debate. But what have you won exactly? Have you convinced the other person, or have you merely created a stalemate? This way of arguing, this way of demanding that other folks justify their thoughts, justify their existence without resorting to referencing my beliefs or my worldview, is really very interesting when you have competing ideologies at a 50,000 foot level. But it's also really interesting when you have competing opinions at a 50,000 foot level. So, Tom, the question is, have you ever tried that with your kids? I think every parent has at least once.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's that whole argument. Go do this. Why? Because I said so. Like, you know what I mean? Like, well,
it's a little more complicated. It's more like when they're like 15 to 17 and they go, well, I want to do da 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 because of da 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 da, and you go, okay, go ahead and try that.
Yeah.
Right, and you make that face right there.
well, here's the thing, though. Here's the thing with my kids, right? So, and you find this funny. You'll find this funny. If I ever said that to my kids on the first shot, like if they said, Dad, I'm going to do this, because this, and I went, you go right in, you go try that. They'd be like, why? Like my kids would come right back at me and go, why are you not fighting this? Because there's something, am I going to do something stupid? Am I going to hurt myself when I do this? Or like,
is there a trap door somewhere back there?
Yeah. So and maybe it's because when they were younger, mm-hmm. I did similar things like, Dad, can I go climb that tree? And I'd be like, sure. If you want to climb the tree, if you fall, you're going to hurt yourself. You break an arm, break a leg. Then you have the whole summer where you can't do anything else, whatever. I'd give them these, and they go, you know what? I guess I don't want to climb that tree. Like, they would. Yeah. So I did that to them, even with the simplest of stuff, like as they were younger. So maybe when they got to that 15, 16, 17-year-old brain, and it was just embedded in them at that point to go, wait, if Dad is okay with this right out the gate, there's probably a problem. And sometimes, by the way, sometimes it was not a problem of I might get in trouble or hurt myself or whatever. Occasionally it was, I'm going to make a fool out of myself and Dad's going to laugh at me. Like, so it was even simple, like, stuff like that, where I'd be like, nah, you go right ahead and do that. I'll be standing right here to watch. And so, yes, I absolutely would have done. I'd done that with my children for sure. So,
okay. Now, have you ever done that with strangers? or people who are not your children in those second level relationships, like at work or, in a larger sort of leadership context. Because I've done that actually with folks that I've led, where I don't lose any, and this is my perspective as leader, I don't lose anything if you fail.
Yeah.
And if I gain, and if you succeed, I might gain something, but it's a 50-50 shot. So yeah, go ahead.
The only time, so yeah, I agree with you. I would add one caveat to that. In my brain, I would try to run through as many scenarios as I can of outcomes to make sure that it didn't hurt the company. Like, so it wasn't a matter of necessarily me being right or wrong or the other person being right or wrong, but this debate and this trial and error type thing that we're going to go back and forth on, if there's a possibility that it hurt the company, I probably wouldn't have allowed it to happen. But if there was no risk of the company losing ground, money, whatever the loss would have been, then yeah, I absolutely, I have done that as well. I've done it in certain circumstances at work, in leadership roles like that. But I wasn't as eager to do that if I felt like the outcome could potentially hurt
the company.
The company.
Okay. Now here's something that I've struggled with often. Well, not struggled with, but I've watched other people struggle with when I would tell them what the thing was to do as a consultant. So I'm going into a company, we'll say Ace company. We'll just pick, actually, no, I'll pick a company from Looney Tunes. Acme. Worst company on the planet, by the way. Worst company. Roadrunner should stop ordering with them and cancel his entire account. Terrible company. That's why, by the way, that's why I tell my kids, actually, I'm going to do a whole shorts episode on the leadership lessons from Looney Tunes coming up here shortly. And one of those is, don't ever order anything from Acme. Worst company on the planet. I tell my kids that all the time. Whoever the sales rep is for Acme needs to be fired. Or it might be the CEO. Actually, the sales rep might be the CEO. Actually, they got one account, and it's Wile E. Coyote. Anyway, so I'm head of the Acme company, right? And or I'm invited, not head. I'm invited in as a consultant, right? And they say, well, this person's doing this person's doing that, and ABC thing happened or XYZ thing happened. And, there were not, I love this line. There were enough people around him or her, usually it's a him, but there were enough people around him or her to buffer the results of this. And so we just sort of let him keep going. Oh yeah. And one of the first questions that I ask is, why don't you let him or her experience the consequences of their actions? And the second line out of that is, well, he makes sales every quarter, so we can't do that. Like, he hits his quota. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's a practical example for leaders of, you've got to engage in some consequentialist thinking, right? Like, people have to be able to experience the consequences of their own actions, particularly adults. And yet we spend a lot of time in our culture, and I think this is, again, something relatively recent, protecting adults from the consequences of their decisions. And I got a bone to pick with that. Like, I really do. I got a bone to pick with that, because
I wonder if there's something to be said about the whole that is a product of the PC environment, right? So, like, you can't say this, you can't do this because it's a woman, or because it's a minority, or because it's like, we have to stay away from these kinds of conversations, because I wonder if part of it is because of the recent push to really, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not thinking of the word. There's a word.
Operationalize equality.
Yeah.
Which you can't, by the way, you can't get to from here, because nobody is equal to anybody else. And equity, let me be real here. Equity is always about the outcomes. It's about the outputs, never the inputs.
Yeah, right.
Never about the inputs. When you try to get equity on inputs, everybody knows that you cannot get there from here, even though we don't want to say it out loud, because there's different There's different competencies. People look for different things. There's different personalities, there's different behaviors. There's different responses to consequences. There's different reactions. There's different thought processes. It is so, no, I'll frame it this way. No matter how good Google is, even they know they can't arrange for equity.
Yeah.
You can hope, you can pray, you can have it as a goal, but on the input end, you can't. But on the output end, the output end there, you can. You can output for equity. You can put in rules and regulations, and you can say, well, this thing can't be said, or this thing can be said, or this number of people has to be hired, and this number of people has to be fired in order to reach some mythical, balance somewhere. And by the way, before you all come for me, yeah, I happen to have brown skin, but that has absolutely nothing to do with, and don't talk to me about internalized racism or internalized white supremacy. Please tell your story walking. Go listen to another podcast. Please tell your story walking. I don't want to hear it. I'm a rationally thinking human being, right? And if you're a rationally thinking human being, there has to be consequences, because equity of outcome does not work, because the inputs always drive the outcome. They just do.
Right.
And at a certain point, we seem to have lost that ability to view human nature through that lens. And it is a tragic view of human nature, which, by the way, does come from Augustine, by the way. The original Judaic converts to Christianity did not have a tragic view of human nature. They had a very Jewish view of human nature, which is different. I'll just frame it that way right now. But Paul first, the Apostle Paul, and then Augustine later on really came on and really put that whole original sin, tragic view of human nature thing onto Christianity, which lasted for 2,000 years. And now we're here where we don't have a tragic view of human nature. And we're gonna do the equity dance, which isn't necessarily gonna work. That's an example, by the way, if you've lasted through that. This is an example, by the way, of demanding that a worldview live up to its own structure. Because if we organize for a particular outcome, there's going to be consequences from that. Are we willing to accept those consequences? I don't know that we are. And I always go back to the example of the plumber, right, in my house. I recently had to get some plumbing done around my house. Honestly, I mean, I live in Texas. I don't need to go into where I live, just like Tom doesn't need to go into where he lives, but I live in Texas. And it was 4 gap-tooth Caucasian fellows who showed up and fixed my pipes. I wouldn't have cared if they had shown up in any other conflagration or I don't care. Fix the pipe.
Right.
I want the pipe fixed. That's the outcome that I want. If a machine can come along and do it, fine, I'll take that too. The outcome that I want is that the pipe is fixed and that, raw sewage stops flowing into my front lawn. Every time I flush the toilet.
Oh,
it was always a terrible situation. It's a terrible situation. Yeah. And by the way, it got there because of the incompetency of another agency, which shall remain nameless on this podcast, damaging the pipe and not repairing it because of their incompetency. And then I found out from the plumber guys that apparently this happens all the time with that particular agency, that particular organization, and they're running around all over town fixing the problems that these incompetent folks have created all over town. And it's a big company. And if I said the name of it,
I can only imagine.
Back to the book. Because Augustine is going to argue against something that will be very familiar. Talk about living in our own time or referencing our own time. Something that's very familiar to us in our own time. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. We're going to go to book 3, chapter 10. of Augustine's City of God. Are our opponents going to reply that the Roman Empire could not have increased so far and so wide, and the Roman glory could not have spread except by continual wars followed one upon another? What a satisfying explanation. Why must an empire be deprived of peace in order that it may be great? In regard to men's bodies, it is surely better to be of moderate size and to be healthy than to reach the immense stature of a giant at the cost of unending disorders. Not to rest when that stature is reached, but to be troubled with greater disorders with the increasing size of the limbs. Would any evil have resulted? Would not, in fact, the result have been wholly good if that first era had persisted? Here is Sallust's brief description of those times. At the beginning of history, the name of kings was given to the first wielders of power. Those kings differed in their inclinations. Some exercised their mental powers, others their physical abilities. At that time, men's life was lived without greed, and each man was content with what he had. Was it necessary that, for the aggrandizement of empire, we should have the process deployed by Virgil when he says, by slow degrees as age succeeded age, life lost its beauty, and its worth declined, as war's fierce madness and lust for gain possessed men's hearts? Now, obviously, the Romans had a just excuse for undertaking and carrying on these great wars. When they were subject to unprovoked attacks by their enemies, they were forced to resist, not by lust for glory in men's eyes, but by the necessity to defend their life and liberty. We grant that. For as Sallust says, as soon as their power advanced thanks to their laws, their moral standards, and the increase of their territory, and they were observed to be very flourishing and very powerful, then, as generally happens in human history, prosperity gave rise to envy. Neighboring kings and peoples therefore made trial of them in war. Only a few of their friends came to their help. The rest, paralyzed with fear, kept well out of danger. But the Romans, alert both in peace and war, acted with energy, made their preparations, gave mutual encouragement, advanced to meet the enemy, and with their arms defended their liberty, their country, their parents. Then, when they had by their courage dispersed those perils, they brought help to their friends and won friendship rather by rendering services than by receiving them. That Rome grew great by such conduct was nothing to be ashamed of. But what was the cause of that long period of peace in Numa's reign? Was Rome being assailed by hostile attacks from her malignant enemies when Numa came to the throne? Or was nothing of this kind happening so that a long continuance of peace was possible? If Rome was at the time being harassed by invasions and did not rush to oppose them by force of arms, the policy by which her foes were pacified without being defeated in battle or overawed by any warlike initiative should have been Rome's perpetual policy. And then she would have reigned in unbroken peace, and the gates of Janus would have remained closed. If that was not possible for her, it means that Rome enjoyed peace not for so long as her gods wished, but for so long as the neighboring peoples wished, who surrounded her on all sides and granted peace to Rome when they did not provoke her by attacking. Unless perhaps such gods will have the effrontery to offer for sale to men something that depends on other men's choice or refusal. The concern of their natural malignity is indeed to work on the evil dispositions of men as far as scope is given them by means of fear or of encouragement. But if they could always achieve their purpose and were never thwarted by a more secret and superior power working against their designs, then peace and victory in war would always be under their control, though the immediate cause of them almost always rests with the passions of human beings. Yet these things generally happen against the will of gods, as is witnessed not only by legends, which are full of lies and give scarcely any information or hint of the truth, but by the actual history of Rome. What do we want? War! When do we want it? No. That was the cry of the pagans in the ancient Roman Empire, and it is the cry all the way down to the West to now. Augustine was critiquing the past in order to arrange the future, as we do now. He was judging the past of the Roman Empire, going back to its original founding in the BCs all the way up to his time in the ADs, and he was judging the pagans for believing in gods that would allow bloodletting in peace that would be just as justified as bloodletting in war. Augustine was opposed to the bloodletting period. He's very Bernie Sanders-like in that little piece there. I could even see Bernie saying pretty much the exact same things, except he would replace it with endless wars, and he would replace references to Rome to America. Augustine didn't understand something, though, that C.S. Lewis, a Christian writer, much later would eventually say, and we cover this in Abolition of Man recently, and I quote directly from C.S. Lewis. He says, "In reality, of course, if any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education, which we both have in our time, and Augustine did not in his, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power." We are the patients of the power that was wielded by the people before us. And we are also the patients of the tradition that was wielded before us. And we rub against that tradition and we reject it and we judge it. Not, of course, understanding that we will be judged by folks in the future and found wanting as well. The thing that collapses us as human beings is time. So Augustine lived in his time and he was done. And this references back, by the way, to Tom's initial example of being in the room with no clock. The thing that, and I'm glad you brought up that example, because this is exactly where I was going. The room with no clock is still bound by time. We are bound by time. I can remember a time when I did not have gray hairs in my beard. I can remember a time when sure, Tom can remember a time when he did not have gray hairs in his beard. When I look in the mirror, I still see a 25-year-old. But when other people look at me, they don't see that. The body betrays us, right? Time continues to go on, and time defeats us. But we are trapped in this thing, right? We have to negotiate with time. And wars can seem to be endless. I mean, the ones that Augustine talks about in book 3 of the City of God, he lays out almost the entire history of the first and second Punic Wars, the civil wars that occurred in Rome, the social wars, by the way, the War of Spartacus, the Gladiator War. He talks extensively about that and about the degradations that were committed during that time. And this was something that for him was recent history. I mean, like, he wrote City of God, I believe it was in 3 something, in like the 4th century. And so this was like literally right on his doorstep. It was as if we would be writing about American history for people 1,000 years from now. Which leads to the question, how can leaders negotiate with time? How do we negotiate? Yeah, I know. This is a big one. Not like we haven't been hitting on big ones all this entire time, but this is a big one. How do leaders negotiate with time? Because it's going to chew up everybody at the end.
I think it's funny that you say, like, as you were talking, and not to be argumentative, no, but like, so I think we do. It's hard to explain. So when you're talking about physical gifts, like, or like, what you look like when you look in the mirror, you see a 25-year-old. I look in the mirror, I don't, honestly. I look in the mirror, I'm very realistic on my view of myself. The difference, so I look at, again, let's just take my yard work, for example. When I was 25, it was brute force, right? I was 25, I had all the energy in the world, I was much stronger than I am now. I could just blow through a bunch of things and call it a day, and then go out and party with my friends on a Friday night. It didn't matter. Whereas now I look at my yard work more strategically. Can I get this done versus this? Is my time better served doing this versus that? And I don't think it's all that different in the work environment, right? So when I was 25, I just threw more hours at it. I would work longer days. I would work more because I didn't know any better. As my knowledge got better and I figured out that there was better ways to do things, I didn't have the strength to work longer hours. Like right now, I can't work a 14, 15-hour day, 3, 4, 5 days in a row like I could when I was 25. Now I look at it and go, how do I make that 14-hour day 6? Because I'm much better off mentally than I was when I was 25. I think part of the problem we have is kind of to your point. Do we have leaders that look in the mirror and see a 25-year-old? Or do we have leaders that look in the mirror and are realistic with what they're looking at? And I think that because I do think that we do have some leaders that look in the mirror and they know who they are and where they are in their stage in their life, and they go back and they go into work and they're going to say, I'm going to approach this from the whole, work smarter, not harder kind of philosophy. Now, if anybody has ever known me in the past and is watching this, they're gonna know that I'm just full of crap right now, because my philosophy my entire life is that I have always hated with the passion of 1,000 suns that statement of work harder, not smarter, because I think we should be working harder and smarter. Like, I don't need to go do physical labor 10 hours a day, but that doesn't mean that I can't use my brain for 10 hours a day. I'm going to continue to work hard at getting myself better. I'm going to work hard at educating myself. I'm going to work hard at getting better at certain things, but I'm also going to be smart about how I do it, right? Like, so again, I go back to I don't think this should be a debate on like, how do we get more time, or it's really how do we get more out of time? It's not how do we gain more time, right?
I mean, that's the negotiation though. Like, so I got to bring up jujitsu at least once every podcast. when I do jujitsu, and I'm eventually going to cleave my courage. Actually, not cleave. I'm going to nail my courage to a post, and I'm going to go to a tournament competition, and it's going to be a mess. I already know it's going to be a mess. However, you talk about working smarter, not harder. I'm going to be tactical, right? I'm going to build a plan. I'm going to work on that plan with my jiu-jitsu coach. And one of the parts of that plan will be, live rolling, sparring with tough opponents who are 25, at least 2-3 days a week, right? Sure. Well, I'm in my 40s. I go 3 minutes with a live opponent and I'm gassed because they're actually trying to stop me. And by the way, they're using brute force, to your point, because they're 25. They're using brute force. Meanwhile, I'm not using brute force. I'm trying not to get injured. And I'm also not 25. So like, I'm aware that I'm not 25. But at the same time, my brain goes, you can do that. It's fine. So the battle between the brain and the body is the battle. And as work, we see this in the decline of relevancy of men in the West, or maybe I shouldn't say decline. The if that's alarmist, the shifting of relevancy of men in the West. The things that you would do with brute force at 25, you better be doing smarter at 30, because the preservation of your body across time is a negotiation. And I don't think we've done a really good job of explaining that to people. So I wouldn't disagree with you. I would merely say, I think you're negotiating in two different realms there. You negotiate with the body and the mind. Mm. And it's not that I agree with you. Well, I would say this. I can work a 14-hour day, but I'm going to be bored at like 4 hours in. I'm like, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing this?
Right.
I can just get up tomorrow because there'll be work tomorrow. That's a brain thing, not a butt sitting in chair thing.
Right.
So is your brain 25? Have you taken one of those like brain quizzes where like your brain is 25 or your brain is 79?
I actually did do one of those, and it said my brain was 33.
Oh, look at that. Okay.
Which, by the way, I would love to be 33 again. I don't know what anybody is complaining about at 33 years old. So, we could say 25 all we want. I think the early 30s is the perfect match of that brain and brawn, right? Like the early 30s. Once you get past the early 30s is when the brain should start taking over. So, well,
but, the number one cause of injury in old men, I'm sure you've seen this meme before. The number one cause of injury in old men is them believing that they are young men. Like, I'm sure you've seen this meme before. I think that temporal negotiation is also complicated by, and we talked about this on a shorts episode, a few episodes back. I think it was like 77 or 75, one of those up in there. You can go listen to it. But it's this idea of the cult of youth.
Yeah.
So
now, mind you, I do think there's a tipping point, by the way. That's what I was going to say. So you and I are a little bit different in age. I'm a little bit older than you are. And I think that I hit that at about 45. When I was 45 is when I really started thinking I shouldn't be doing that anymore. Like I didn't allow my brain to cheat me into thinking that I could be brute, that brute force. It was right around 45 or so that I started feeling like, because even to your point, even in my early 40s, 41, 42, I was like, I got this, whatever. I can pick up that 100-pound, whatever, just throw it on my shoulder and whatever. Right. But by the time I think there is a tipping point. Now, bring it back to the leadership part of it. I still believe that. I still believe that there's a tipping point where we're talking about the difference between mind and body. And I think in the workforce, it's mind and mind, but I think it's your strategic mind versus your tactical mind, right? Your tactical mind being brute force and your strategic mind being your in our analogy about mind versus body. Mm-hmm. I think the mind part is your strategy part and your tactical part is your body part. And I think that there's the same thing happens. There's a tipping point in your work life where you realize, to your point, if I really put 100% effort in for the next 6 hours, I should not have to work the rest of that 14-hour day. Like I should be able to put off other stuff until tomorrow. But I think, and I'm not sure if it's 45. I just think that they're the same rule applies, that you're going to work 100 hours a week if you have to, until you hit a tipping point where you realize you shouldn't have to do that anymore, and you start thinking more strategy and you start employing more thought process that allow you to think big picture and move objects with a unified force versus one person. Like you start, I do, again, I don't know what the age is. Maybe it's less than 45, because I do think that, to your point, I do think we do physically think we're younger than we are for a lot longer. Maybe it's the mid 30s in the workforce where you start thinking, all right, I'm at an age now where the younger people think I'm old, and the older people still don't know the older people still think I don't know what I'm talking about, but I do. And I need to kind of start shifting my mindset to really like getting the older people to buy in and the younger people to realize that I am now the one to turn to for answers.
Okay, that's that. So that goes directly to that whole cult of youth.
Yeah,
we have this whole thing, and it's so deeply embedded in our culture that when you call it out, people think you're a weirdo.
Right.
And the thing to call out is this: we have now fully bought into the never trust anybody over 30 kind of idea. We fully bought into that. Like we were fully bought in probably in 1985. We were like fully bought in, right? The problem is, we know at a practical level that the best people to be in charge are the most mature people. And quite frankly, I'm sorry. I'm glad you're 35 and you've had some experiences. And by the way, I was saying this when I was 35. Like I went out as a consultant. I started out as a consultant when I was 33 years old. And one of the first things I said out of my mouth was, I'm stupid. I'm 33. I just haven't lived long enough.
Never trust anybody over 30. Yet every world leader is like 60 in their 60s and 70s.
Right. Like
never trust anybody over 30, but yet we continue to vote in 70-year-olds as president.
And 80-year-olds, 70-year-olds, and 80-year-olds. We can't even get a 50-year-old in there.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
50 is too young. So on the one hand, we have this never trust anybody over 30 kind of thing. But then on the other hand, we have the schizophrenia where we know are tied inimically together, and that they are both valuable things that interlock. And it is this negotiation across time that we don't do well. And maybe it's just a thing in America that we don't do well. I suspect it probably is. For my international listeners who are in places like India and in South Africa, and in Turkey and in other places, your mileage will probably vary. But in America, if you're listening internationally, in America, for sure, we are trapped between those. We're trapped on the two horns, right, of that dilemma, right? Why do 30-year-olds still listen to Warren Buffett?
Yeah, because he knows what he's talking about.
Right. And how come he knows what he's talking about? And how come is it that the 30-year-old, how come is it that my Instagram feed on business Instagram is full of like 30s and 40-year-olds who are chasing clicks and clout and every other freaking thing? But if you put them up against Warren Buffett, I'm going to take Warren Buffett every day and twice on Sundays.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. We have to, at some point, we've got to publicly say, yeah, we're trusting the old people.
Yeah, I think that's hilarious the way that you phrased it too. It's like we're fighting against what we project as our thought processes versus what is really our thought processes, right? Like we hide behind that social norm of like never trust anybody under over 30, right? Like that's what, because that's what, if you think about it, and 1985 might be a little early. I was thinking like the late 90s is really when this, like right when the .com boom started and like the tech companies really started because us old folks have no idea what we're doing in tech, right? You can't hire somebody in their 40s or early 50s because they don't know how to use a computer. You have to get somebody under 30 because now it's all about the under 30. And that was a whole millennial movement, which by the way, millennials are turning 40. So your own philosophy is going to come back to bite you in the very near future.
You will be judged by the measure that you have judged others.
Right? Exactly.
And you will be found wanting by the standard that you have established for others. So be careful. Tread lightly. I believe that Augustine would say the same thing. Tread lightly. Back to the book. Back to the city of God. We're going to turn the corner here. As Augustine has something to say here in book 2, chapter 25, that I think sheds some light on morals and the Enlightenment project. In addition to, as we turn the corner here, the value of classical discourse, which is something we've been sort of talking about throughout this entire podcast. So back to the book, back to City of God, book 2, chapter 25 by St. Augustine of Hippo, the Penguin Classics edition. Can anyone fail to see and understand, unless he is one of those who prefer to copy such gods and to be kept free from their society by the grace of God, what efforts these malignant spirits use to give by their example a presumed divine authority to criminal acts? They were indeed seen joining battle among themselves in a wide plain in Campania, shortly before the citizen armies fought their shameful battle in that very place. For first, a terrible din was heard, and before long, many people reported that they had seen two armies fighting for several days. And when the fighting stopped, men found what looked like the tracks of men and horses, such as could have been left on the ground as a result of that encounter. Thus, a battle among divinities, if it really happened, gives excuse for civil wars between men, and one may notice the malice or the misery of gods like these. While if it was a mere pretense of a battle, the only purpose was to gloss over the crime of civil war by giving it a divine precedent. Civil war was already underway, and a number of other loathsome battles had already been fought with frightful bloodshed. Many had been touched by the tale of a soldier who stripped the spoils from one of the slain and recognized his own brother when the corpse was bare. Moved to abhorrence of such civil strife, he killed himself on the spot and fell on his brother's lifeless body. To mitigate the disgust caused by such tragedies and to inflame the ardor for this abominable warfare, the malign devils, whom the Romans thought of as gods and the proper objects of worship and veneration, decided to show themselves to men as fighting among themselves, so that the natural affection between citizens should not shrink to imitate such battles, but the gods' example might rather excuse the crimes of men. With the same astuteness, the evil spirits also commanded theatrical shows, I've already said a good deal about this, to be dedicated and consecrated to them, in which the enormities of the gods were celebrated on the stage in song and enacted narrative. A man might believe or disbelieve the actual stories, but he could see that the gods were delighted to have such acts represented, and thus he would feel free to imitate them. And so to prevent the idea that whenever the poets record fighting among the gods, they are libeling them by inventing discreditable stories, the gods have themselves given confirmation to the poets' songs to deceive mankind by displaying their battles before men's eyes, not only in stage plays, but even by enacting them in person on the field of battle. I have been forced to say this because the Roman writers have no hesitation in saying that the Roman Commonwealth had been ruined by moral degradation and had in fact ceased to exist at all long before the coming of our Lord Christ Jesus. They did not blame their own gods for this ruin, yet they blame our Lord for the transitory disasters which cannot bring a good man to extinction, whether he lives or dies. Yet Christ's teaching is full of instructions for the promotion of the highest morality and the reproof of wickedness, while those gods of theirs never took the trouble to impress such commands on their worshippers so as to save that commonwealth from utter ruin. In fact, they were more concerned to ensure its ruin by corrupting morality through the baneful authority of their example. I do not suppose that anyone will after this have the face to assert that the commonwealth perished because the gods then deserted all the shrines and altars. Like friends of virtue, disgusted at the vices of men, since they used their efforts by all those signs in the shape of entrails, auguries, and prophecies to boast and commend themselves as foreseers of the future and as assistants in battle, and thus are proved to have been present. If they had absented themselves, the Romans' own ambitions would have fired them with less ardor for civil war that did the prompting of the gods. I'm going to quote, as a backup to Augustine, a study that was recently released, and we're going to have the link to that study from the journal Nature. I saw this a couple days ago, and it struck me because Augustine is talking about moral degradation in the year of 300 something when this book was written, and well, we are 1700 years.
Have I mentioned the more things change, more things stay the same? Have I used that line yet?
You have, and I'm about to give you some scientific proof to back this up. So, from the journal Nature, I'm going to quote extensively or read extensively from the abstract to the study, and you can go Google it when you click on the link in the show notes below the player on the podcast. When I quote directly from the journal Nature, anecdotal evidence indicates that people believe that morality is declining. In a series of studies using both archival and original data, we show that people in at least 60 nations around the world believe that morality is declining, that they have believed this for at least 70 years, and that they attribute this decline both to the decreasing morality of individuals as they age and to the decreasing morality of successive generations. Next, we show that people's reports of the morality of their contemporaries have not declined over time, suggesting that the perception of moral decline is an illusion. Finally, we show how a simple mechanism based on two well-established psychological phenomena, biased exposure to information and biased memory for information, can produce an illusion of moral decline, and we report studies that confirm two of its predictions about the circumstances under which the perception of moral decline is attenuated, eliminated, or reversed. That is, when respondents are asked about the morality of people they know well or people who lived before the respondent was born. Together, our studies show that the perception of moral decline is pervasive, perdurable, unfounded, and easily produced. This illusion has implications for research on the misallocation of scarce resources, the underuse of social support, and social influence. Close quote. So, you'll be happy to know, Tom, moral decline is an illusion. It's just something that you believe based off of the things you're seeing in your time, and it's based off of biased psychological phenomenon, biased exposure to information, and biased memory for information. So you only remember the negative things of the generation you're in. And I haven't read the whole study, but I'm going to suppose that this is where they're going. You only remember the negative things of the time in which you live, but unfortunately, you only have access to a limited amount of information, although you do have Google, but we'll leave that aside for just a second. You have access to a limited amount of information that is only based on your time in your narrow neighborhood, and thus the people in your narrow neighborhood and the folks, and your neighborhood is your generation. The people in your generation are always worse than the generations that came before you, but this is an illusion. And so you'll be happy to know that you're under a delusion, and you could just get rid of that.
It kind of reminds me, I read this study once about intelligence levels, right? That every generation thinks the generation behind them is less intelligent because of something they're doing, right? Some stupid thing, some fad, whether it's clothing or dance styles or whatever. When the reality is actually quite the opposite. The reality is our intelligence levels are actually increasing exponentially as we move forward. It just changes, and it's noticeable in like certain subject matter, right? Like, for example, geography, right? Like I watched this guy. It was TikTok. All right, I was just wasting.
Here we go.
It was like, but the guy was like, this is just interviewing random people on the streets of Times Square in New York City. And he said, he's asking questions like, how many states are there in the United States? And you'd be the range of answers were just dumbfounding to me. Because to me, that seems like such an idiotic question, right? And what's the capital of the United States? One person, I'm not gonna say male or female, but one person said A. The capital A in the United States of America. That should be the capital, And I'm thinking to myself, how have we gone this far? But those same people are the ones that are purposefully tweaking the algorithms on YouTube or TikTok, or they know how to manipulate product placement. And so they're not less intelligent, but I think it just changed. So to your point about the moral degradation, I have this weird suspicion that it's literally identical, that it's the same, no matter what time or era that you're standing in. It's just a matter of how you interpret the information pouring into you and how valuable that information is to you personally, right? So like, and by the way, I do think that there are some foundational pieces that aren't really degrading as much as we think they are. I think it's the layered moralities that we're talking about versus for example, that whole, treat somebody with respect, like, treat somebody as a human. You're going to treat somebody as a human being when you meet them as a human being. That's just natural for you to do. That to me is a moral compass. Like that's your moral foundation, is being treated as a human being. When you get when you get a couple layers after that, that's where I think it becomes argumentative. Like you can argue that whether it is or it isn't, or whether the illusion exists or not.
So Steven Pinker, the writer Steven Pinker, who's written a ton of different books about a ton of different things, everything from linguistics to social anthropology, wrote a book a few years ago called Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. And he asserted in that book that everything is actually getting demonstrably better. And he went back and looked at data on things like violence and murders, data on things like the number of state-sponsored wars that have occurred over the course of time, the number of deaths in those state-sponsored wars.
Sure.
He looked at economic data and who was living on $1 a day, or not who was living on $1 a day, but how much, based on our equivalency, how poor people were in the past versus where they are now. And by the way, there are massive leaps that have occurred in the course of human history at a massive, talk about time, at a massive temporal scale. So one of those great leaps was the Industrial Revolution. Another great leap was the move from feudalism to medieval feudalism to a more Renaissance / Middle Ages type mercantilism, right? That was another massive leap, right? And by the way, he traces this not just in the West, but also globally. And he does, of course, talk about how, and this is one of the challenges of writing a piece of writing a book that defends the Enlightenment, typically against postmodernism. And by the way, the postmodern belief is that there is no meaning, everything has gotten worse, and we should tear the whole thing down, deconstruct the entire thing, and have it fall to the ground because we're stupid and we're patriarchal and we're racist and we're bigoted, the usual things. And Pinker stands in opposition to all of that and says the Enlightenment project is the best. And by the way, the Enlightenment project he surmises, or he puts together as the project of human reason being used to make human beings' lives incrementally better. Did climate change come along with that and the melting of ice caps? Yeah, but now we have more people out of poverty, so we can actually do something about that. Or did the ability for us to industrialize at scale allow World War II to be the most horrific war that we've ever fought in human history? Yeah, but it also allowed us to have babies to go off and fight that war, so we wouldn't have tyranny.
It also gave way to more democratic countries in the world,
along with penicillin and a few other things, that were kind of important, that I kind of like. Oh, by the way, I'm a fan of Enlightenment. I may not necessarily be a fan of man all the time, but I am a fan of the Enlightenment. I do think that collective human reason does need to be pushed, and I do think that the collective defense of the Enlightenment is one of the things that we're doing on this podcast. I am not a postmodernist. I don't believe that the theories of postmodernism have any hold. As a matter of fact, I believe they lead to a discourse in a meeting discourse problem. But this thing in Nature, right? The journal Nature, and again, we'll have that link both to Steven Pinker's book and to the journal in the show notes. This idea that that we believe that morality is declining for the last 70 years. The question that I would have for the journal Nature, and it's probably maybe it's exposed in the study, is why do human beings believe this? And beyond just the bias factor, although that's hugely important, but why is that so pervasive? And I think it's because, I'm going to answer my own question, I think it's pervasive because it's easier for human beings to believe a negative than it is for them to believe a positive. And this gets back to the whole like nature of fallen man and all that kind of stuff that Augustine sort of laid the groundwork for, laid the helm for 1700 years ago now. There's another piece that goes along with this, and we, like I said, we were turning the corner. We want to wrap up here. There's another piece that goes along with this, and so I want to go back to City of God. I want to read our final selection here, because there's another piece that goes along with this that I want to touch on. And I think it's very valuable for us to understand when we think about discourse around the Enlightenment and around postmodernism and even around argumentation. So back to the book. Finally, the last section, City of God, Book 4, Chapter 10. We're going to read a couple pages in this. And then I'm going to read a long section about debate, because I think there's some ideas in here that that need to be explored. So, Book 4, Chapter 10, City of God. Why do the pagans give Juno to Jupiter for wife to be called sister and spouse? The reason is they say that by tradition we assume Jupiter to be the ether, the upper air, and Juno in the lower air, and these two elements are joined together, the one above the other. Then it follows that this Jupiter is not the subject of the statement, the whole universe is full of Jupiter, if Juno also fills some part of it. Or is it that each of them fills both elements, and this married pair are at the same time both and in each? Then why is the ether assigned to Jupiter and the air to Juno? And in any case, the two of them would be enough. Why allot the sea to Neptune and the earth to Pluto? And they must not be left wifeless, so Salacia is provided for Neptune, Proserpina for Pluto. For as the lower part of the sky, the air is, they say, occupied by Juno, so Salacia has the lower part of the sea, and Proserpina the lower parts of the earth. They try to find ways to botch together their fables, but without success. For if their account were true, their teachers of old time would have spoken 3 elements, not 4, so as to distribute each of the married pairs to their particular element. As it is, those teachers undoubtedly asserted that ether and air were different elements, but water, whether upper or lower, is still just water. You may conceive some difference, but not enough to make it anything but water. And in spite of all the imaginable differences and distinctions, lower earth cannot be anything but earth. Observe further that the whole material universe is made up of the 4 elements. Then when will Minerva come in? What will be her sphere? What will she fill? She was set up in the capital with both Jupiter and Juno, although she was not the daughter of both. If they say that Minerva holds sway in the upper part of the ether, and that this gave the poets occasion to invent the story of her birth from the head of Jupiter, why is she not reputed the queen of the gods on the ground that she is higher than Jupiter? Is it because it was improper to place a daughter above her father? Then why was that equity not observed in the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn? Is it because Saturn was conquered? Then they fought, did they? Certainly not. All that is legendary gossip. Very well. Let us not believe the fables. Let us have better ideas about the gods. then why is Jupiter's father not given at least an equal place of honor, if not higher? Because Saturn represents duration of time. So they worship time when they worship Saturn. And the implication is that Jupiter, king of the gods, is a child of time. Is there anything improper in calling Juno and Jupiter the children of time if he is the sky and she is of the earth? For undoubtedly, sky and earth are created things, and Virgil is basing himself not on poetical fictions, but on the writings of philosophers when he says, the omnipotent Father, ether all supreme, descends with fecund showers upon the lap of his glad consort. Ugh. Upon the lap, that is, of Tellus or Terra. For here also they are determined to have some difference, and in the earth itself they distinguish Terra, Tellus, and Telumo. And all these gods are called by their special names, assign their own separate functions, and worship at their own rites at their own altars. The earth is also called the mother of gods, so the fictions of the poets are more tolerable, since it is not in the poetry of the Romans, but in their sacred books that Juno was found not only as sister and spouse of Jupiter, but also as his mother. They make out the same earth to be Ceres and also Vesta, although more often they claim that Vesta is simply fire on the hearth, without which community cannot exist. And the reason why virgins are by custom consecrated to her service is that fire, like a virgin, does not give birth. All this inanity deserved to be abolished and swept away by him who was born of a virgin. Is it not insupportable that while they ascribe to fire so much honor and one may say purity, they are not ashamed sometimes to identify Vesta with Venus, thus making nonsense of the virginity which is honored in her attendance? For if Vesta is Venus, how could the virgins do her due service by abstaining from the works of Venus? Or are there two Venuses, one a virgin and the other a wife, or rather three, or one for virgins, who is the same as Vesta, one for married women, one for harlots? The last was the goddess to whom the Phoenicians used to give a present, earned by the prostitution of their daughters before they gave them in marriage. Which of these is the lady wife of Vulcan? Certainly not the virgin, since she is a husband, not the harlot. Perish the thought. We must not seem to insult the son of Juno and Minerva's fellow worker. Then we infer that Vulcan's wife was concerned with married women. I hope they will not imitate her behavior with Mars. There you go, back to fables again. But what kind of justice is this? To be angry with us for talking like this about their own gods, and not to be angry with themselves for taking pleasure in watching the gods' depravities in the theaters. And remember, incredible though it would be were it not proved quite incontestably that those representations of the gods' disgrace were instituted in honor of the gods. That's how you upend somebody else. So let me quote extensively from a Substack I follow occasionally called The Rational Male by a guy named Rollo Tomasi. By the way, not his real name. And I quote from him, and this may be helpful in understanding what I just read there from Augustine and understanding our entire podcast. This is from a recent blog post he wrote. And I quote, think about what a debate is and what it has meant in the past. The nature of the argument has changed a lot over time. In the past, argument took the form of classical discourse. This wasn't the back and forth process we know today. It was a rhetorical speech intended to persuade. It would be for a single person, but primarily the speech was directed at an audience. After classical discourse came modern discourse. This was back and forth process between two debaters who took the oppositional roles, but essentially engaged in a cooperative process whose goal was to establish truth by determining which case was more persuasive. Then came postmodern discourse. This takes the form of a no-holds-barred struggle to discredit not only the other speaker's position, but the speaker himself. The goal is not to prove the opposition wrong, but to silence it so that one's own position will dominate conversation. Thus, classical discourse intended to persuade an audience. This is important because modern discourse intended to establish a truth by playing an advocate. You have committed a logical fallacy. Postmodern discourse intended to establish your views as a social standard via sheer dominance. You are a liar. Most arguments nowadays are postmodern. What goes unnoticed in the social media age we've entered a post-discourse age. Argument itself is obsolete. Arguments are no longer meant to persuade. They no longer establish truth, nor do they determine whose views will dominate the social discourse. Persuasion requires a receptive audience. Postmodern discourse in the social media age has made this largely impossible. To establish truth is to test. It's not a contest of theoretical constructs of logic based upon belief sets. Whose worldview will influence thinking and language is determined by how those ideas spread themselves and whose repetition they require. Debate is no longer relevant either as a means of discovery or dominance. who wins the debate is not determined by debating. It is determined for forces entirely external to the debate. This means that arguing is no longer empowering. It is merely a means of entertainment. They don't want a definition of objective truth. They want an archetype they could agree with or hate on to determine if you're their ideological team, if you're on their ideological team, or the opposition. And I would add to that, close quote, and I would add to that in order to gain clout or clicks.
It reminds me, I had a teacher when I was still in, I'm pretty sure it was still elementary school when I was a kid, that told me the difference between right and wrong was the majority. And social media has really made that come to fruition, right? Like, so like you can, I don't know if you've ever done that. I tend not to actually get engaged on social media with what's supposed to be debate, right? But it ends up becoming vilification, right? So you make a comment on somebody's post and all of a sudden 500 people go on there and rip you apart. So now, regardless of whether or not your statement was right or wrong or truthful or factful, and if you just don't agree with these 500 people, you get vilified. And now that post becomes some sort of enshrinement of why the person who posted it was right? Like it's not, I just find it fascinating that something that was said before the internet was even a thing, because that's how old I am. So when that the difference between right and wrong is the majority. So if you are part of the majority, then you become right. That's basically because the minority can be bullied into just going away. And I think I never really put those two and two together until you started reading that. And I started thinking about that statement and that comment that she made, that teacher made. And I was like, God damn, we just manifested this. Like, we went from it being a debate in Congress of like, again, the Senate, 51 votes to 49, that could create a law and put it on the president's desk to sign. And whether it's right or wrong is just because it's the majority. And we went from that to like social media vilifying any individual person that doesn't believe what these 500 people believe. And it's like, it's strange to me that she said that with no such thing as the internet. Now all of a sudden we have put that into some sort of like actuality in real life, not just in a legal sense or in making policy or whatever, but now it's with anything we do, we can have the same outcome. It's kind of insanity to me.
Are we at a structural moment? And what I mean by structural moment, and not pivotal, what I mean by structural moment is this. So on the one hand, you have people like myself, right, who still are Pace, Rollo Tomasi, and even Augustine. I still believe in classical discourse of a speech, as he framed it here. I also still believe in modern discourse. I still believe in that. I believe in the Gore Vidal, William F. Buckley debate idea. I still believe in the city of God, Augustinian, I'm going to write this thing and you're going to deal with it, kind of idea. I still believe in that. That's why we do this podcast in the way that we do it, right? I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I don't engage in postmodern discourse. Like, if you have something to say to me on the internet about some episode that I did where you found offense, you better send me an email and it better be well written. Otherwise, like, I don't respond to flames. I block and report people or accounts. I just don't do it. And part of that goes back to just sort of like when I began really putting stuff out on the internet, putting content out on the internet, I had to decide if, roller guy 64 at yahoo.com was really somebody that I was going to be listening to. Like, do I really care about your opinion? And the answer was no, actually I don't. But I do really care about Tom's opinion. And so if Tom sends me an email that says, hey, dude, you missed the mark, and here's the ways you missed the mark, I'm going to take that seriously.
I'd just call you. I wouldn't send you.
Yeah. You're just gonna call me or you're gonna text me or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Or anybody else that we know mutually, right? Like I could name any of those people. Fine. Send me an email, send me a text message. We will have a conversation. We'll have a nuanced conversation and we'll get to the bottom of it, right?
Sure.
And I think that's what we're missing in a social clout driven age is the nuance. And that drives me absolutely nuts because most problems have simple solutions. I fundamentally believe this. Most problems have simple solutions, but the problem itself has to be nuanced, has to be cleaved and clarified so that we can know what we're actually talking about. But if we're not interested in that, if we're just chasing clout and clicks, that's a real problem. And I wonder if we are at a structural tipping point where we're tipping into something else, or if this is just a moment where all of us who remember the old way are just sort of being put back on our heels kind of a little bit for a moment. And don't worry, like you could get, I remember when I remember watching Mike Tyson fight back in the day, and I don't, it wasn't the Evander Holyfield fight. I believe he fought Riddick Bowe, right?
Yes.
Riddick Bowe fight. Yeah. And I remember watching it with my father and Riddick Bowe rocked him and he went back on his heels a little bit, but he's Mike Tyson. So there you go. And most of postmodernism, most of everything that goes on in social media, it's Riddick Bowe. That's okay, but I'm Mike Tyson. I've got the weight of 1,100 pages and 1,700 years behind me. How are you going to beat that?
Right. I wonder, as you said that, I started wondering in my brain, I wonder if every generation has had that moment. Because as we talked about before, I read the study where every generation thinks the generation behind them is less intelligent when in fact they're not. But I wonder if that intelligence level hits a point where it puts that generation back on its heels. I'm kind of curious about this. I think somebody should check in. Somebody smarter than me should really look into this and try to figure that out. If there's a rinse and repeat here, if this is happening pretty consistently, like I said to you a few minutes ago, millennials are turning 40. We have millennials turning 40. They can no longer subscribe to the don't trust anybody over 30 thing because that includes themselves. So that generation that kind of, I won't say they started it, but they really put the power behind it and now on their heels.
Right.
Because of something. So I wonder, I don't know, when you said that, putting our generation on our heels, I wonder if there's some validity to that, but more so from a structure of a cyclical thing, that happens pretty much every now. Then let's go one level deeper to that and say, has the tipping point moved? Did the greatest generation of all time hit it at 60, and then the baby boomers hit it at 50, and the Gen Xers hit it at 40, and the millennials hit it? You know what I'm saying? I wonder if there's some. There's a research project here.
Well, it is. I agree, and maybe the journal Nature. Maybe we should reach out to them. We should have someone on the podcast from them about how we're not in moral decline. Maybe they can sort of answer some of that or extrapolate some of those ideas out from that study, because I think there's something parallel to what they did there and what we're talking about, right? I also wonder if. And this gets back to that whole idea that Augustine and Thomas Aquinas with his Summa Theologica, which we won't cover on the podcast because it's 14 volumes. It would be 3 years. It's not going to happen. Thank you, everybody, for reaching out to me about Summa Theologica. I'm aware of it. Thank you. Man spent an entire lifetime writing it. Thomas Aquinas did. God bless him. But we're not doing that. And I don't have that kind of will. But books like that, Shakespeare, which we've covered on we've covered on the podcast, the Bible, which we'll be covering this month again. Those books sit at the basement of Western civilization. They're at the cornerstone of Western civilization. And they do create by their mere existence, whether you like the content or not is an irrelevancy. By their mere existence, they do create a framework of rhetoric and argumentation and debate, discourse, right? That people can engage in. And maybe we're at the end of, and this is where maybe I take a little hope. Maybe we're at the end of the whole Nietzschean experiment where there is no God and there is no truth and there is no nothing. And maybe that rocked us back in the West for 100 years, maybe 120. But I think maybe we're at the end of that, because there has to be, I'll frame it this way: the empire built by Augustine and Shakespeare and Aquinas and the Bible and Austin and all of these people that we've read on the podcast, the empire built by them will strike back. And there's a lot of weight behind that empire. They got Galaxy class cruisers, and they're going to show up. And the rebels lose in this one. This isn't I mean, that's where the Star Wars analogy stops. The rebels lose.
Yeah.
The empire wins because
it's foundational.
There's a lot of weapons to bring to bear. And if you eliminate that structure, then how do you talk about the fundamental nature of reality? Or even just how do you socially negotiate across time? Any of the things we've talked about today on the podcast. How do you do any of that without having some context of shared meaning? And you can't. All right. Well, I think we've covered a few things. Anything you'd like to leave for leaders about staying on the path? Any last words, Tom? We kind of got real philosophical today.
Yeah, we really did, didn't we?
We got deeply philosophical.
No, I mean, I've been on this with you. I don't even know how many times at this point. I love being on this podcast with you because I think it really brings out all the old phrases that I remember when I was a kid, and all the things I've been told that I didn't even realize that I was putting into practice, but I was putting it into practice. I think that part of it, I think it boils down to, leadership boils down to a simple thing of, if you are true to yourself and treat people with, at the bare minimum, respect, you'll figure some stuff out even on your own. But there are plenty of books out there to read. There's plenty of, people like yourself to reach out to and talk to about fine tuning it. You certainly can do more work with yourself and fine tune yourself and become a better leader than you are today. And if anybody tells you that they're at the pinnacle of their life and they're perfect, they're lying, because you should be literally learning this stuff till the day you die. So, but no, I think that there's a starting point there that everybody is capable of, which is be true to yourself and be a good person and treat people with that minimum respect. And some of this stuff you'll figure out as you go. But I again, like I said, with podcasts like this available and books are available and people that that are really good coaches and out there, you can certainly fine tune it a little bit better as you go.
I agree. And I would add that it doesn't hurt to at least have a passing understanding of the nature of how persuasion and argumentation and discourse, which is just conversation, is constructed.
Yeah.
I do fundamentally believe that the art of conversation is being eroded, but human beings, it'll never fully go away because human beings can't get away from it because we need it. It's too much embedded in us. And 20 to 30 years of smartphones are not going to overcome millions of years of evolution, or if you're not an evolutionist, thousands of years of human civilization. It's just not. There's too much there. The foundation, the concrete is poured too deep. For leaders, you have a responsibility to know how to construct a conversation, how to persuade, how to communicate, and how to engage in discourse beyond merely just telling people what to do, barking out a few orders, and expecting them to be obeyed. Sometimes you've got to convince people. Sometimes you have to provide a structure so that people's faith can be rewarded, to paraphrase from Batman Begins, or maybe it was The Dark Knight. It doesn't matter. It's a really good line. I'm a sucker for a good turn of phrase, as you all know. I also think that morality may not be in decline, but there is definitely a shift going on. And if you can feel it in the zeitgeist, if you could feel it in your, well, I'm going to use the word that Augustine would use, if you could feel it in your soul, that's something to pay attention to. That's an alarm bell It's indicating that there's something that you have missed as a leader that you need to fix. There's some way in which you have wandered off the path, and now you need to figure out how to get back on it, not just for yourself and for your community, but also for the people that you lead. Hopefully this podcast can help you do that during this month of June and every other month that will come afterward. I want to thank Tom Libby for coming on the podcast. I want to thank him for
always my pleasure.
Wrapping his arms around this very challenging book. And there's like 30 some odd or 40 some odd books in actually 22, I'm sorry, books in City of God, divided up into smaller chapters. Again, it's 1,100 pages. So we'll be revisiting this further on down the road. But until that time, well, that's it for me. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at LeadingKeys.com. That's LeadingKeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that Little Red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. Co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan, this is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And, of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Hey Sansorels Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.